The kind of transitions that we're talking about across all of the different aspects of the energy system are unprecedented, but it doesn't mean we can't do it.
Something like 90% of consumer goods come into this country through our shipping network. By 2050, it could be 10% of all emissions.
How do you feel about avocados?
Well, I'm a bit too old to be a millennial, so I'm not quite as enthusiastic about them as some people, but I don't mind them on toast.
Welcome to Emissions Impossible with Kim McAllister
and Claire Spooner.
Now, I am a broadcast journalist, and Claire, you're from the EPSRC, and I'd suggest that you are a specialist in issues related to climate change.
I will take that. That's very flattering of you to say so, but I will definitely take that.
There we go. This is why you're on this podcast, because you know what you're talking about. Me, I'm just here to steer the ship. See what I did there?
I did. I love that. That's fantastic. That's very good. You put a smile on my face.
Well, we're here to talk about shipping and climate change, so I thought I'd throw a few puns around.
I do love those kind of transport-themed puns.
So what are we discussing today, Claire?
We are talking about sustainable shipping. It's one of those areas that people don't realise. Something like 90% of consumer goods come into this country through our shipping networks. It's an invisible world almost, and it creates a huge amount of emissions. There's something like 100,000 ships delivering our freight to us from around the world, and they're creating something like 3% of global emissions all come from shipping. But who would have thought it? You know, we just don't think of this space. We just accept that we can just rock onto our local shops and pick up our clothes and pick up our IKEA furniture. Yeah. We don't think about how it got here.
God, no. It just comes the next day. Exactly when
and then you put it together. Exactly. And it was fine.
I don't put it together. Don't ever ask me to put anything together from IKEA.
My husband hates that place. But I suppose why it's really important to look at it today, though, is by 2050, it could be 10% of all emissions.
Whoa.
And that could be a bit of a problem. You know, as we tackle other areas and we sort out the research needs for those areas and reduce those emissions, well, that means that the emissions from more trade through shipping will increase and there'll be a larger percentage of the pie.
And are we counting these emissions? Who's responsible for reducing them and for hitting the targets?
At this point in time, we're not counting them. Which is a bit weird. I mean, we're aware of them. We know it's 3%. They're not included as anyone's responsibility. And that's a little bit tricky. It's a really hard thing to do, you know. All our international frameworks haven't actually looped them in. It's the same for aviation. Those emissions aren't looped in yet. Now, they will be imminently next year. International law around shipping is a bit like, you know, there are pirates today and it's a bit strange. I know they're pirates. And when we say pirates, we think, oh, so romantic, you know, we're thinking all of the
Well, I'm thinking about Johnny Depp, don't know about you.
Pretty much, yeah, swashbuckling. Yeah. That's not quite how they are today.
No.
International shipping is, you know, it's a really complex space and being able to track the emissions from that is really challenging.
And if nobody's tracking it, then is there any incentive for the shipping industries to move away from carbon? Probably not, right?
Well, I think they're getting there. I mean, they know it's a massive problem and they know that it'll, you know, their consumers will be really interested in it. And by consumers, I'm not just meaning, you know, the end consumer. I'm thinking of the retailers who actually purchase their goods, the supply chains.
So right now, fossil fuels are the main source of energy for shipping, right?
Yeah.
But we're working on alternatives. What are we looking at?
There's a number of alternatives. We could do hydrogen. There's a really great project up in Orkneys called High Seas. You see, I knew I'd get another Celtic reference in.
Love your work.
It's called High Seas, and they're actually starting to trial hydrogen-powered ferries, which is an amazing opportunity we have. Another opportunity we have is around maybe using ammonia as well as a different fuel stock. But there are other things we can do as well, and this is going to blow your socks off.
Right.
We could do wind power.
Wind power on ships? Surely not.
I know, it's amazing. So there's a project over in Belfast with Artemis who are looking at wind power and kind of bringing in those hydrofoil technologies where you can raise the ship out of the water a little bit and it'll go faster and they'll use sail power. And it's just amazing the potential we have on that one. We could have batteries. And I don't think battery for a ship.
A battery-powered ship. I'm pretty sure my son has one of them, but we're not talking about the same thing here, are we?
Slightly different scale, just a tiny bit.
Okay.
So the scale there is, they wouldn't use it to do the international waters, but when it's coming into harbour, they can do a thing called cold ironing. Now, I'll be honest, I have no idea why it's called cold ironing.
This is too parochial, two Scottish women on a podcast talking about ironing. No, we need to step away.
step away. But that is the process basically where it's got shoreside. Sorry, I'm lucky. That's
What's it got, Claire?
Shoreside electrical power to the ship. And we can also do slow steaming, which is basically it's where your ship goes at a slower speed. You just pootle along, and that produces less emissions.
You make it sound so simple.
You know what, when I say slow shipping, I can't help but think of one of those ancient old liners where people are just, walking around in first class.
That sounds like a lovely way to travel if you're on the top deck, not so much if you're in third class.
No, that would be pretty terrible.
It's amazing to think how shipping's evolved, actually. And I love that we've come full circle and we're going back to wind power on ships. Isn't that wonderful? It's
Seriously.
Like, right, we went through a phase of coal, we went through a phase of all this carbonisation, and now we're like, nah, actually, we're going to go right back round. And it's not just the carbon that we're releasing into the atmosphere, is it? There's other issues with using fossil fuels on ships.
Yeah, it's quite a number of unintended consequences from fossil fuels. So we have high CO2 emissions. We also release, it's quite polluting, the diesel they use. So you get a lot of black carbon into the atmosphere, which is really bad when they're shored up, but it's bad in the seas. You get biofouling, where the fossil fuels are accidentally leaked into the sea and they just leach out there. And one of the weird ones that people don't think about is the noise pollution. The noise from a ship can travel 24 hours, disrupting whale patterns and other seafaring creatures. Marine life. It can completely disturb that marine life. And that is the unintended consequences of this globalization.
This is totally fascinating because I had never before talking to you considered how important shipping is to my life. I mean, I saw the Suez Canal story and I thought, wow, maybe we should be more aware of this. But I think it's a really important thing to talk about in the context of climate change because it is a big polluter. There's a lot of projects going on, a lot of research going into it. So we've spoken to a couple of people for this podcast to tell us more about it. We've got Dr. Tristan Smith, who you suggested. Why did you suggest him as a great speaker for us?
So he is an expert from UCL, an incredible advocate for the space, and very, very knowledgeable about shipping and climate change.
For the last 11 or 12 years, I've been focused on questions or research around the decarbonisation of shipping.
And this is a big issue, isn't it, for climate change mitigation, because emissions have been very difficult to measure up till now, haven't they?
Yeah, I guess the measurement's not been the big difficulty, but the action to do something about them has been hard. And that's because shipping, just like aviation, are the two sectors which are not accounted within national budgets. We get to about 1 gigaton of CO2 for shipping, and that is very significant. If you think about it in equivalency terms to national budgets, that's equivalent to approximately the government of Germany. So it's one of the 6th or 7th or 5th biggest emitters, depending on how you count, relative to the kind of league table of where the greatest sources of emissions are. But the solutions to it are not straightforward, which is one reason why it's a sector which has received less attention than others.
And it's maybe not a sector that your average consumer is that aware of. You know, it's not as easy to see and to kind of understand, is it?
Exactly. There's a phrase that's often used which is called sea blindness, which is to do with the fact that in our modern society, unless you happen to live in a port or to be working in the industry itself, you can be quite unaware of the nature of the industry. And it's also politically low priority. I mean, it's an unfortunate consequence of sea blindness that because we're not aware of it, politicians are not being elected in any country because of how they prioritise the shipping industry and its future needs. Unfortunately, and maybe this is similar to other industries as well, we notice them when something goes wrong. We notice the energy sector or the nuclear industry when we have a nuclear disaster. Otherwise, we just perhaps forget that it exists. And in shipping, that's obviously the case too. So we have had a series of very high-profile disasters in shipping, particularly where vessels have been grounded or have leaked a lot of oil or cargo into sensitive areas. And there are a few incidents every year. And the Suez incident was a particularly clear articulation of how important shipping is to the supply chains of all societies, and in particular, very tangibly, the Western societies, because a lot of the goods that we rely on, even if it's something as simple as integrated circuits and chips that are used in automotive manufacture that then affect the prices of new cars that we see in forecourts.
So now that people are maybe a little bit more aware of shipping and the importance to everybody's daily life, what kind of changes would you like to see that would decarbonise this industry?
It's actually relatively a straightforward change that is needed. I mean, we can summarize it as two steps. The first is to maximize its energy efficiency. The second is to transition away from using fossil fuels. And there are only two basic choices for a liquid fuel, and those are biomass-derived fuels or hydrogen-derived fuels. Or alternative to that, we could use batteries. There isn't enough bioenergy or biomass available to decarbonise a sector like shipping, as well as meet all the other societal demands for that feedstock.
And so are you seeing an appetite for that from the shipping companies themselves?
Yes, there's been an extraordinary response in just the last 2 years, actually. And a lot of that is to do with the fact that that regulator, the International Maritime Organization that I mentioned at the beginning of the call, has clarified that it will decarbonise shipping. It's made a greenhouse gas strategy, adopted it in a resolution, and committed to an absolute reduction of at least 50% of its total emissions by 2050. Now, in a growing sector like shipping that has got growth in demand, that actually means that individual ships will have to reduce their carbon intensity or their footprint by somewhere between 80 and 90%. So the absolute emission reduction is actually a smaller part of the story. And that magnitude means that we're seeing, or we will see policy that drives shipping away from fossil fuels.
That's really encouraging to hear that, because, you know, as a consumer, you can quite often feel quite powerless and wonder what possible change you could help to make. So as a consumer, are there choices that we can make? Is there pressure we can bring to bear on companies when it comes to this part of industry?
Yeah, there are loads of choices consumers have a role to make. And it's increasingly clarifying, but it's still quite hard to make those choices. So there are definitely retailers who are selling us goods that we buy in supermarkets or clothes, for example, who have got progressive decarbonisation policies, and we can see announcements from companies like Apple and Amazon and Walmart and Sainsbury's that are very clear about what they see as their future, and they are increasingly turning to something called their Scope 3 emissions, those that are associated with the supply chains that bring their goods into the customers.
But we are very impatient, aren't we? And especially with Amazon, we order it and we get it the next day. There's a reason it comes to us so quickly, because it's being shipped, you know, and there's a fantastic sort of logistical supply chain there. So do we need to stop being so demanding?
Well, you can easily turn this into a demand response, i.e. consume less. And that's certainly one way to do it. You don't have to do it that way. And I think we need to have a spectrum of options. There is also a very small price premium associated with purchasing goods that have got very low supply chain or even origin carbon emissions. It's just at the moment there is perceived in many of the retailers that the demand from customers isn't there. And I think that's a trend which we will see change extremely quickly, especially in Western societies. So at the moment, because they perceive that that's not there and they don't have a handle on the data, they aren't currently offering you the choice that says, when you order something, I want it to be shipped with zero emissions, or I want it to be shipped with all the emissions that it currently has. But as soon as you articulate that, the price increase for asking for it to be shipped with zero emissions is going to come in as a very low number. It's a fraction of a percent or a few cents on a pair of trainers. For a movement of those trainers from Asia, where they might be manufactured, to the retailer in Western Europe or North America, there's a few cents increase in the price of those trainers to make sure that they have been bought there on a ship that has used something which isn't a fossil fuel. So it's really not material to our purchasing decision. It's just that information hasn't been presented to us. And what we're finding at the moment is that ship owners and operators are starting to lose access to capital unless they're able to communicate that they are on a decarbonised trajectory.
That's really encouraging, because I would assume that if you were going to make a big sacrifice in your buying habits, that it would cost you more. But it's great to hear that it wouldn't necessarily be the case, and that if it's just a fraction of a percent, as you're saying, then most people would happily pay that if they saw what that was doing for the planet, wouldn't they?
Absolutely. For those of us in Western society, we can quickly say, well, relative to our disposable income, we can absorb that small increase in price.
So if you could give 3 tips for a consumer listening to this as to how they might affect this change, what can we do? What can we do as individuals?
I mean, it's pretty easy to find statements on the main retailers that you use. So I buy a lot of my food from only a small number of outlets, and I can easily access what those outlets are currently stating as their intent. Now, I don't think you need to get deep into the specifics of those or be an expert, but I think you can quite quickly read between the lines when a company is greenwashing and when it's actually showing that it's doing genuine projects. And so I would look out not for language that's to do with net zero. If you read that company is talking about science-based targets, those are often considered to be the gold standard of a commitment that a company can make.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds like good advice. And is there any sort of obvious no-no? Is there anything that when your friends tell you, oh, I've just bought this, you go, oh no, I know that's going to have been shipped for, and caused all this carbon into the atmosphere? Is there any huge no-no that you can think of?
No, I don't think so. I mean, there are some pretty perverse stories about some of the ways that we move things around. I don't actually, this is just an urban myth probably, but it kind of illustrates some of the scale of the problem, where seafood caught, say, off the UK in the North Sea or other is frozen and shipped into Asia to be shelled and then shipped back into the UK for consumption, because the labour costs in the UK are so high. So it's much cheaper actually to put the good on a ship and move it. So there are some extreme examples of supply chains that have evolved because shipping and transport is so cheap and labour differences are so great between one part of the world and the other, that I don't look at anyone consuming seafood and go, therefore you're responsible for that, because obviously it's going to vary, and some seafood that's eaten in the UK will have been processed locally and could be incredibly low carbon footprint. I think being conscious of a food's supply chain in combination with how it's been produced is quite important, and that's one that I particularly try to think about.
How do you feel about avocados?
Well, I'm a bit too old to be a millennial, so I'm not quite as enthusiastic about them as some people, but I don't mind them on toast on the right day. I think the risk that we end up with is a kind of, this is okay and this isn't, and it's, there are ways in which avocados could be produced and transported which could be very low carbon.
I think when I'm thinking about when I do my food shop, I mean, there's certain things that you look at when you're going around your supermarket. You look at sale by dates and you think about the meal that you're planning. But something I've started to do more often is look at actually the country of origin. And sometimes it absolutely bowls you over. You're like, why on earth has this come from South America or Australia or somewhere thousands and thousands of miles away? So is that good practice, would you say? Is that a good starting point for awareness?
Yeah, I look at that too, but I think there's a real risk that as consumers we then ostracize developing countries and their potential for economic development. So we take avocados as a great example here, because they often come in certain markets from Latin America. And if we take Latin America, countries like Chile and Peru have 50% of their GDP from exports, and a very large percentage of that comes from exporting soft fruits. Now, if you then say, right, we can only consume vegetables locally, what you're then saying is that certain countries that are not developed economies today get left behind because we've decided as consumers some quite knee-jerk reactions. So rather than decarbonising the supply chain and looking at the origins of that fruit and how it could be quite efficiently or sustainably produced in certain countries around the world, we then move to a different solution. And I think that would be, that's where this is an equity and a climate justice issue.
Yeah, I just wish there was a simple solution. There very rarely is to these things, is there? The better the labelling, I guess, that allows you to make that decision. So you could say, this avocado's come to you from Peru from a sustainable shipping source. That would be great. Then you could happily buy it and you would have your avocado on toast and be the millennial that I'm sure you really want to be. So we just maybe need to inform ourselves a bit better, maybe.
Yeah, and that's a two-way process. So we have to be intelligent consumers, but the retailers have to get better at communicating.
And also, if you ever have taken your children to the supermarket, you're not reading anything on those labels. You're just trying to get the heck out of there before somebody has a tantrum. Dr. Tristan Smith there. And we've got another great interviewee coming up in the form of Professor Alice Larkin, who you also suggested, Claire. You're on fire today.
Alice is amazing. She's really knowledgeable in the space. She undertook a project called Shipping and Climate Change a few years back. She's brought in many different thematic areas. So it's not just about the technological solutions. Well, obviously, I care about that. It's also about social science interactions and environmental interactions to make sure we really understand the ecosystem.
I feel very, very lucky indeed to to have a job where you feel like you're making a contribution and making a difference. And that's a big theme of the University of Manchester more generally, but particularly in our research area. Such a challenge, such a great, huge challenge that actually is it's motivating to be able to contribute to. It can also be very demoralizing, given the pace of change and how much is needed to be done.
And that's what I would really like to bring out in this episode is climate change can be overwhelming. It can really worry people. But I want to talk about all the things that are being done and all the initiatives and all the research and all the great projects, particularly in shipping for this episode, although we're going to talk about lots of different things throughout this podcast. So when it comes to shipping, I know that you've done some research yourself across that sector. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I came to look at shipping a bit later in my research career. Started looking at the international shipping sector, and one of the interesting things there is that there are actually a lot of technological options. There are also lots of operational changes. There are things perhaps to do on the demand side as well. In shipping in particular, there are lots of different ways in which you might be able to reduce carbon dioxide emissions that are produced because ships basically burn fossil fuels to travel around, like most transport modes in the world. It was kind of limited in terms of how much research had been done to explore the options for decarbonising the shipping sector. To do something a bit more radical, a bit more, more of a step change, that has not had, there's not been a great deal of incentive to do that. So when I say step change, I'm thinking about how could you retrofit the existing ships, for example, with wind propulsion technologies. So our existing fleet, the problem with ships and planes is they last an awfully long time. So it's not the same as in car transport or other areas where you tend to swap out your appliances or your goods more quickly. Mm-hmm. So we were looking at some of the wind propulsion technologies, and I've had been working with a researcher looking at Flettner rotors. So they use what's known as the Magnus effect to create a pressure change as they rotate. So these are kind of cylinders on top of the ship. And as a result of that, they can have a propulsive force. So the tests that have been done have typically shown, something like about an 8% cut in CO2. So then we've been modelling to try and to see, okay, well, how could you enhance that? Are there ways in which you could differently route your ships in order to find the kind of the best wind regimes that are going to give you greater benefit? It sometimes sounds a little bit old-fashioned to think, oh, well, wind propulsion is a technology we should be using again. But, if you look at the yachting races and so on, there's some amazing technology out there in relation to wind propulsion. Mm-hmm. And that's the kind of technology. What's interesting particularly about wind propulsion is that often when you look at other things, so maybe alternative fuels that you might combust in the same kind of engine in a ship, you still tend to have other emissions that still emerge as a result. Wind propulsion actually stops you burning the fuel in the first place. Now, it wouldn't necessarily take away all of the fuel need. It really offers an absolutely clean alternative. That's the kind of thing that we've been exploring. Slowing a ship down makes a huge difference to the amount of fuel consumed. With our consumer goods world, people like things on time. They like to order things and they arrive quickly, and we don't really think about how on earth has it got to us. So it's trying to look at that whole system. You look at, what can you do on the operations, doing it differently? What can you do on the technologies? What else is out there to try to cut emissions from ships?
That's fascinating. I love that we've kind of come full circle back round to wind power. It's a bit like digging up Edinburgh to put the trams back in. It's like, oh, right, we're back here again.
But it is really interesting,
yeah. And also, I guess there's, you don't have any biofouling when you're using wind. You're not leaking oil into the sea. You're not causing all these other, disasters that cause all the headlines. And this is an interesting thing when, as a consumer, you're thinking about shipping, because as you say, you don't think about how your goods get to you. You don't imagine, that there's a massive tanker full of, these shipping containers with all your clothes and furniture in it. And then there's a disaster like what happened in the Suez Canal, or there's an oil spill, and suddenly we are hyper aware. So in a way, does it take a disaster to make things happen?
Disasters certainly draw attention. I think this is just a personal thing, not from a research perspective, but, we know that news comes and goes and people forget very quickly. So whilst it kind of, it's interesting at the time and people share photographs of, the ship that's stuck in the Suez Canal and, you get a few memes and things like that, really does it really change how we think about the world, about what we consume and how we go about doing things? I think perhaps things that have been more powerful in that regard have been like the youth voice and the youth movement around climate change. I think that has really shifted the goalposts, not specifically in relation to shipping, but more generally in relation to how people are thinking about climate change. And we certainly see it in the students that come into the university, really interested, really want to know what they can do to contribute to make this, to make the situation improve. But there's also lots of frustration there from younger voices, which is completely reasonable, that this is a problem that my generation hasn't solved. We haven't managed to come up with solutions, despite the fact that we've been talking about this for decades.
I mean, there's wonderful research going on. You've obviously detailed some of it. As a consumer, is there something we can do? Is there something we as individuals can inform ourselves about or act on?
I think one of the things to sort of really think about when we're talking about individuals is that we're all connected with other individuals, and we're quite powerful as a result of our, in communities, in groups, and so on. As an individual, just debating it for a start down, the pub or in a cafe or wherever you go and talk to people, and exploring the issues, raising awareness, rather than sort of sitting at the internet and just informing yourself. I mean, lots of our social science colleagues, I'm really lucky that Tyndall Centre is interdisciplinary, so work with a lot of social scientists, and information isn't enough. Information doesn't mean that you then do things differently. Sharing and understanding with each other, but then also who can you influence? So if you're a school teacher, you can influence a class of students, you could influence your colleagues, you could run initiatives and influence those initiatives at a school level. Maybe that influences your board of governors, or as an individual, you could write to an MP, you can make your point, you could keep making your point. And I think that sometimes we underestimate how important that can be. Our MPs work very hard across all of the different parties to try to represent the constituents. But if they don't know what we think and they don't know what we're worried about, then how can they represent us? So I think making our voices more heard is definitely worthwhile. It can feel overwhelming because you think, I'm on just one voice, one letter, one email. If you'd had that chat down the pub and 10 of you actually wrote in, then actually you could have an influence. It's interesting actually how podcasts have become something that is very popular recently, and I think that actually that is a very good mechanism.
I think people are interested. It's just that they find it sometimes impenetrable, or they maybe don't know where to go to find out more. And then you go on YouTube, you could find something that's nonsense, or you could find something that's really based in scientific research. So it's quite tricky, I think, for people who are interested to find the right information. And then in terms of funding the research, were you funded by the EPSRC for your shipping research?
Yeah, so we had two really great projects funded by the EPSRC. So we had a project originally called the High Seas Project, which was the first project that I had as a principal investigator. It was just a group of us in Manchester, really are sort of dipping our toes into trying to take some of what we'd learned from the aviation sector and apply it in shipping, look at that broader shipping system. As I explained, we're sort of looking at demand, looking at operations, looking at technology. Yeah, we got a huge amount out of that project, built our understanding of some of the challenges, engaged with the industry and stakeholders and policymakers. And off the back of that, we joined a much bigger collaboration with UCL. It was a big project led out by UCL. Again, EPSRC funding, industry funding as well. It was called Shipping in Changing Climate. So not just looking at the reducing CO2 emissions, but also looking at some of the climate impacts aspects of that as well. So that's been hugely important. It would be great to get some further funding. We're working on proposals at the moment. And EPSRC has been it's a funder that allows us to not just do the technology and explore some of the technology options, but also brings in some of that interdisciplinary perspective, which is so incredibly important and has been emphasised over the years. Bringing the social science in, trying to work with stakeholders, absolutely fundamental to these problems of climate change, and that needs to, that is a really positive thing that's funded, because that absolutely needs to happen. Yeah,
that's great to hear. So what's your next step then? What would you like to continue to research in this area?
So we are focused now on this issue that we have the ships that we've got. How do you decarbonise the assets that you already have? How do you retrofit them? What does that mean in terms of, there are lots of different ship types. So for example, for short sea ferries, There are options around electrification and hybrid, which could suit that kind of shipping. But then there are other types of shipping, deep sea shipping, that would not be viable technology. What are the alternatives for those sorts of ships? But there's also this issue of, potential early scrappage and material use. So some of the colleagues in the Tyndall Centre also work on life cycle assessment, where you try to assess the environmental impact from, cradle to grave and reuse and so on, and circular economy. We're developing a project looking at some of these short-term aspects or shorter time frame aspects of what could you do in the short term and what are the unintended consequences, bringing in particularly this wind propulsion stuff. We're hoping to get a paper published that really demonstrates the power of this wind propulsion technology as being something that's really viable. It's not pie in the sky.
So, in conclusion, are you optimistic?
Am I optimistic? And I pause. I am optimistic in relation to the shipping sector. I think it's really challenging to incentivize, and of course it's global, and it's not like talking about changing car transport in the UK, which is a much smaller defined problem. But I'm optimistic because I do think, we have seen big shifts in the past in terms of how shipping works. We just need to go faster. And it's going to be unprecedented. The kind of transitions that we're talking about across all of the different aspects of the energy system are unprecedented. But it doesn't mean we can't do it. We need the political will. We need the investment in the right places. We need to stop pretending that these things are going to be sorted out in 2050 when that new technology comes along. We need to do things with the technologies that we've got now. And I get optimism from the youth movement.
Professor Alice Larkin there, who also is really into astrophysics, which is my side hobby. So there you go. We had a nice wee
I quite like your side hobby. I think your other podcasts are really good. I think people should listen to Space Junk. I think that's a very good one.
Space Junk was a fun one. Yeah, the Great British Liftoff. I love making podcasts, but we digress. What I really liked about what Alice was saying was how urgent this is. And I think certain parts of society are well aware how urgent climate change and its mitigation is. Others are dragging their heels a little bit and thinking, we've got till 2050. Do you find this?
Yeah, we do find it a bit. And the problem is 2050 is actually only 28 years away, 28 and a half years away is where we are now. And actually, research does take a wee time to develop and mature and make sure it's the right research, that we have the right outcomes coming through. And that's one of the challenges. It can take 5-10 years for a technology to be proven.
Yeah, and do you know what was interesting? Because I always feel guilty as an individual, like I'm not doing enough, I'm not being green enough, I'm not making the right choices. But both Tristan and Alice made me feel a little bit better about that guilt by telling me that it's not actually all on the consumer. A lot of it is to do with the retailers and the service providers. And actually having these conversations and making your voice heard, whether that's writing to an MP or joining a march or getting involved in an organisation, is actually really beneficial as well. So that made me feel a wee bit better.
Yeah, it's really hard for the consumer to know how the product came into the country. Just because your avocados came from Mexico, it doesn't actually mean that you know how they got there. They might have flown, they might have shipped, they might have come in any number of different methods. You don't know that, and it doesn't tell you on the packaging. So what you can do is look at the company you're buying from's environmental sustainability plan. That'll give you an idea of at least what they're trying to achieve. It's a complex landscape. The key thing about your retailer is they control the supply chain. They are influencing their supply chains every single day. So if you know which retailers agree with your principles and help us on that journey to net zero, then you can influence them by buying certain products, by shopping more at those stores that are making the difference. And I think that's a really easy way for us to help. Or listen to podcasts like this.
There we go. That's step one, is just listen to podcasts. Inform yourself. Exactly. Figure out whether it matters to you and how you can actually make a difference. Because I think that's really important as part of this whole conversation, is how can people get involved, and how can we actually help all of these efforts. And so I think that's really good option. And we'll put some links into the show notes as to how you can actually find this information.
I always say make sure that people support further research. I would say that I have a wee vested interest, but I think, making sure that we undertake continued research. The job is rarely done. There'll always be new innovations coming around the corner that we can optimize, that we can improve on. And I think it's never a done journey. We have to continually make sure that we're investing in research and innovation to deliver these changes.
So how would you sum up the problems and the solutions in the decarbonisation of shipping?
So I think the problems are it's really complex. There are different owners around the world and they use different supply chains and they deliver to different markets. So it can make it very hard if we don't act as one unified global body on this. We're currently using fossil fuels and making sure that we choose the right technological solution moving forward, be it hydrogen, be it electric, be it ammonia as your fuel. We need to do that research to make sure that we have the correct solution identified and then we get global buy-in.
And before anyone gets too upset about this, there are some solutions and lots of research and lots of great technology that are trying to tackle this, right?
Yeah, I think there are some really innovative projects coming up. Japan has a number of projects looking at hydrogen passenger ferries at the moment. We have the opportunities around hydrogen shipping, which could be a real game changer when it comes on stream. And I'm very confident it will come on stream. And really, the moment is now to start exploring these different opportunities and move away from fossil fuels.
Excellent. One step closer to Emissions Impossible.
Emissions Impossible is a Connect production for UK Research and Innovation. If you like what you hear, please hit subscribe.